So I want to start off by welcoming everyone to today's event. We are very excited to have you with us today as we hear about the most recent release of the USA Giving Report. As a reminder, this session does qualify for continuing professional education. So if we move forward to the next slide, you'll see a QR code here. I'm going to do this with you so that I can get my CPE. But if you click into that QR code, you'll want to register for the event if you're wanting to be able to obtain CPE for today's event. This session does qualify for 1 hour of CPE as long as you attend today's session and are on with us for at least 50 minutes during it. And you'll need to enter 3 out of the 4 different code words that we'll display throughout the presentation. So if you use that QR code and you sign in, you'll see a spot after you sign in, kind of on the right-hand side of your mobile device, that'll say code words. Right there, you'll enter 3 out of the 4 code words in order to obtain your CPE. And then at the conclusion of the event, we'll remind you to click out of that CPE. My name is Justin Hayes, and I am a partner here with Katz Sapper & Miller and the leader of our not-for-profit practice. KSM is a nationally recognized advisory, tax, and accounting firm with over 800 employees, and we now have 7 different office locations, including our headquarters here in Indianapolis. When you look at our firm, community is one of the key pillars that we build our missions off of. We serve approximately 300 not-for-profits annually and are deeply invested and involved within our communities. We encourage our team members to serve on boards and to go out in the community and regularly volunteer so that they can have a direct impact in the communities in which they live. This firsthand experience gives us a very unique perspective as we work to serve you, our clients, and drives us to make sure that we are providing you with every avenue we can for success. That includes events like today, where we have the opportunity to partner with other professionals to bring you high quality information that helps empower your organization to be stronger, smarter, and prepared for what lies ahead. Today, we are very excited to have Christina Daniken with us, who is the editor-in-chief of Giving USA, the annual report on philanthropy, and is a research associate at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Researched and written by the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and published by Giving USA Foundation, this report is the longest-running, most comprehensive study of its kind. It offers insights into the sources and uses of philanthropy within the United States and provides more than 70 years of data for the trends that we see within the philanthropic community. I personally am really excited to hear what we find out in the 2025 report and to see what trends have shifted, have changed, or have stayed consistent to what we've seen historically. Christina, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your expertise and the insights from this report. And I'll turn it over to you to go ahead and dive on in.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And thank you to all of you at KSM. I always enjoy coming back each year and presenting this information. We are actually really excited to share the new launch of Giving USA. And it's an interesting year. So we look at the year of 2025 and total giving and some of the details as far as what happened in giving that year. So again, my name is Christina Daniken. As in my role as editor-in-chief of Giving USA, I pull together not only the data and our estimates for charitable giving, but also we look at trends, events, other research on giving. So that's what we're going to cover today. First, we'll talk about total charitable giving in 2025. We'll look at 4 different sources of giving. We'll also look a bit at some economic trends that influenced giving in 2025. We'll also look at charitable giving across 9 different subsectors. And then finally, a little bit of information about how you can turn the findings of this year's report into action steps for your nonprofit. So let's just dive in. So total charitable giving reached, the big drum roll here, $617.2 billion in 2025. So total giving surpassed $600 billion for the first time ever in 2025. We reached a new high in current dollars for 2025, growing 5.7% from 2024. So total giving actually grew 3% in inflation adjusted dollars. We did have strong financial markets and other economic indicators that are typically associated with very strong charitable giving. And that is what drove that big number, over $600 billion for the first time. Oh, sorry. Okay. Um, so when we look at charitable giving, we often look also at the S&P 500 because we have found that there is a causal relationship or a correlation between those two markets. So, one of the things that we look at is inflation adjusted dollars versus current dollars. So, in this slide, you see the dark line there, the dark dotted line, which indicates giving in current dollars, whereas those gray and gold bars represent giving in inflation adjusted dollars. So you can see in 2025, we did reach a new high in terms of current dollars. But when you look at those bars, you can see that the highest gray bar shows that inflation adjusted dollars for total charitable giving were still at the highest in 2021. And here again, we have this S&P 500. We do see a correlation, but you also see that charitable giving tends to be a smoother line, and that is mainly because it doesn't vary quite as much as the dramatic changes that we see in the S&P 500. So in 2025, we saw that the S&P 500 grew 16.4%, but total giving actually only grew 3% in inflation adjusted dollars. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that here in a moment. But first, let's look at, as far as the total giving in 2025, where did those dollars come from? The largest share of those dollars continues to come from individual donors at 64% in 2025. So individual giving reached $394.2 billion in 2025. Now that percentage of the total share is down just a slight bit from giving in 2024. And the reason is because bequests actually grew as far as a total share of that pie to 10%, up from 8% in 2024. So bequests in 2025 accounted for 10% of total giving, which was $62.19 billion. I like to look at both of those together because really all of those dollars come from individuals. So not only what we account for under individual, but under bequest as well. So you can see that when we combine those two, we're looking at just under 3/4 of all giving in 2025 coming from individuals. The only difference, of course, is that bequests are gifts made at the end of life. Let's also look at foundation giving, which accounted for 19% of total giving in 2025. That's the same share as in 2024. So giving by foundations reached $117.15 billion in 25. And finally, let's look at corporate giving, which stayed at 7% in 2025, which is the same as we saw in 2024, for a total of $43.6 billion. Looks like we're ready for a code word, our first one, 401. If you'll take a few moments to just tap that into your phone. And I will move forward here in just a moment. Okay, let's move forward. Looking at those four sources in more detail, on this slide, I show you just how much the giving for each of those sources actually grew in 2025. So all of them grew, particularly in current dollars. So the blue bars are the current dollar growth. The orange bars represent growth in inflation adjusted dollars. So you can see the big story on the page here is the significant growth in bequests, which in current dollars was just under 20%, still at 16.6%, even when adjusted for inflation. So that was the most substantial growth that we saw in sources, but we also saw good growth in foundation giving, which in current dollars was 5.7% and 3% in adjusted for inflation dollars. So now I'd like to just dive in a little bit more into each of those sources. First, we'll start with individual giving. So again, individual giving was at $394 billion in 25. In current dollars, that represents 4.1% of growth, or just 1%, 1.4% adjusted for inflation. Now, given that charitable giving is closely tied to our financial markets in the United States. So the reality is that the financial markets, the stock markets, grew pretty substantially in 2025. So the reality is we would have expected more growth by individuals in 25, given the strength of the financial markets. But if you'll pause with me here for just a moment to think back to everything that was happening in 2025. So remember, in the early part of 2025, we were hearing a lot of talk about tariffs, a lot of political activity there, but we were also seeing some business responses to that. So individuals were starting to be concerned about their jobs. Companies were concerned about increasing costs with imported products or imported supplies. So we really weren't sure about how that would impact competition with our business sectors. So individuals were starting to feel a little bit concerned about rising costs of living, concerned again about the stability of their positions. We were also looking at substantial changes at the government level in terms of funding for nonprofits. We were looking at government cutbacks in just government positions. So there was a lot of insecurity, and that insecurity tends to have a major impact on giving. So in our data, where that shows up and impacts the numbers is under that consumer sentiment numbers. So you can see that individual giving grew 4.1%. The S&P 500 actually grew 16.4%, but consumer sentiment was down over 20%. So that had a significant impact on individual giving. So while that number for consumer sentiment is not a record by any means, but it is as low as we've seen historically. So that probably had a dampening impact on individual giving. Aside from that, I'd like to just point out that we did see that wealthy donors continue to represent a larger share of individual giving. So in Giving USA, we consider mega gifts to be any donors who are making those gifts who give 0.1% of that total or more. So when we analyzed for those kinds of donors, we found that mega gifts or mega donors accounted for $19.2 billion in 2025. I will say that's up from $11.7 billion in 2024. So that's some substantial growth that we saw there by wealthy donors. As we already saw on the previous slide, bequests showed strong growth in 2025, as well as they have in recent years. So giving by bequest grew to $62 billion in 2025. Again, that's growth of 19.7% in current dollars. That's still 16.6% even when adjusted for inflation. I do always like to point out that bequests do fluctuate substantially from one year to the next. But with that in mind, we have seen considerable growth in bequests in recent periods. So 3 of the last 4 years saw 20% or more growth in current dollars and bequests. And that has outpaced overall giving overall charitable giving in 2 of the last 5-year periods. So on this chart, we're actually looking at 5-year periods of growth between 2016 and 2020 for the first couple of bars, and then second, looking at that growth between 2021 and 2025. So you can see bequests are the blue bars. You can see that bequests in both of those 5-year periods have grown over 20%. So 27.5% between 2016 and 2020, and 20.7% from 2021 to 2025. So you can see compared to the orange bars, which represent overall giving, we are continuing to see really substantial growth in bequests. So I can tell, I know in the back of everyone's mind, we're asking, is this the start of the great wealth transfer? My answer is maybe. So we'd like to look at some more years of data before we claim that the great wealth transfer has begun. But I will just leave you with this information, this data, and tell you that it's very, very interesting. And we'll keep an eye on that future data. Let's move to giving by foundations. So giving by foundations has increased steadily over 15 years. So this graph and that nice steady rising blue line represent giving by foundations since 1985. So actually for the past 40 years. In 2025, we saw that foundation giving grew 5.7% in current dollars, and that represents 3% growth when adjusted for inflation. So I'd like to also point out that giving by foundations reached a dollar amount of over $100 billion for the first time in 2022, coming out of that pandemic. But what we have seen since 2022 is that foundation giving has stayed at an amount over $100 billion, which is very encouraging and continues to grow. So a lot of this is due to the increased value of assets held by foundation endowments that have grown along with the S&P 500 and the strong financial markets in recent years. Ready for our second code word here, 281. I'm going to pause and give you a few minutes to get that number put into your app before I continue. Okay, I hope everyone's got the 281 code, and we'll go ahead and move forward to corporate giving. So corporate giving held steady in 2025 after several years of very strong growth. So again, corporate giving reached $43 billion in 2025, and that shows growth of 3.1% in current dollars. When adjusted for inflation, that drops to growth of just about 0.5%. We consider that to be flat. Anything less than 1%, either up or down, we consider that flat. So that means that corporate giving showed the smallest growth in 2025, just for that 1-year period of any of our sources. But I think it's important to show that when we look at growth in corporate giving or any of our sources over 5-year periods, that corporate giving has actually grown the most over that 5-year period. And again, our most recent 5-year period is 2021 to 2025, and we see that corporate giving grew just under 10% during that period. When I am out there talking to nonprofits, what I'm hearing is, oh, it feels like corporate giving is reducing or slowing down. So my response to that is always, it doesn't seem to be dropping, but it does appear to be changing. So what we are seeing is that with very large corporations, many of them are consolidating their giving at the corporate foundation level, so at the highest level. And they're becoming more strategic in that. So with their corporate foundation giving, they tend to be giving more in areas that are strictly related to whatever their mission is. So, for example, in Honda and Toyota, those companies are focusing their corporate foundation giving on education in STEM fields, particularly engineering, moving away from all other types of giving. But on the positive side, what corporations also tend to be doing at the local levels. So, across the country, across the world, at local levels in neighborhoods or in communities where they have a physical presence, what we're seeing is that they're pushing more of their local giving down to their employee matching programs. So, this is helpful to know as a local nonprofit because a lot of that giving comes through not only their employees, but then the matching that the corporations are doing for those local gifts. So it's a bit of a shift there for a lot of nonprofits who are looking at corporate giving.
Christina, we have a good question from the audience, and I think I know the answer, but to what extent is government grants in here? I mean, I think that's not part of your survey, but certainly would affect the categories you've already talked about. Can you confirm, how you look at government funding?
Sure. So you're exactly right, Cassie. In Giving USA, we strictly look at giving that goes to nonprofits that is from one of those four sources that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to back up a little bit here. So those four sources again are individuals, corporations, foundations, and bequests. So because we do not consider government giving to be charitable giving, or philanthropic giving, we actually don't look at or analyze any government giving. I will say some of the trends, of course, we can't avoid looking at or considering the impact in 2025 of the changes in government giving. And I will say, too, that we saw giving change not only at the federal level, but also at state and local levels. So for nonprofits, just know that we feel your pain. We see that from some of the research that we looked at, it did look like from other organizations that do analyze charitable giving, what we saw was about a third of all nonprofits across the country and across all different subsectors did experience some kind of disruption in federal funding. And actually, I should say government funding at all three of those levels. And that came in the form of everything from just absolute cuts, so complete clawback of those government dollars, to things like lower or reduction in government grants to just those being slowed down. So the dollars from government grants coming in slower to nonprofits, things like that. But unfortunately, that is not an area that in Giving USA that we analyze.
Thank you.
Mhm. So let me go ahead and move forward to looking at the different subsectors. So in Giving USA, we ask, where did those dollars go? We tend to look at 9 different subsectors, so I'd like to just go over those briefly here. Looking at the largest share of the pie, which is that dark brown slice, religion continues and has for the past 40 years, continues to represent the largest share of all giving. In 2025, that represented 23% of total giving dollars for a total of $151.58 billion. So I do just want to clarify when we say giving to religion, we are strictly looking at giving to houses of worship. We do look at various areas, various religions, but we're not looking at, for example, food pantry dollars that maybe are associated with a particular house of worship. We are strictly looking at giving to that religious organization. For giving to specific areas such as food pantries or other childcare distributions, anything like that, we count those, even though they might be associated with a particular denomination or a particular religion, we actually count those donations under the other subsectors that are more specific to that type of donation. So a strong one, as an example, is actually human services. So human services accounted for 15% of total charitable giving in 2025 for just under $100 billion. This is interesting to us because for the first time ever in current dollars, we saw human services or giving to human services overtake education. So this has been a trend that has been in play since the pandemic. That right around 2020 and 2021, we started seeing giving to human services increasing and growing steadily until now. Human services is at $99 billion. Third, actually, is education, which accounts for 14% of the total, which reached around $92 billion in 2025. When we look at giving to education, we're looking at giving at all levels of education. So many people think of the large gifts and grants that go to education in terms of higher education, colleges and universities. In Giving USA, we also include independent schools, private independent schools that are K through 12. We also, in this period, are starting to look at giving to public schools through foundations that have been created by those public school organizations. So this includes those private charitable dollars to those foundations. We also include early education. So early education programs are growing. So those would be the programs that are for children who are not quite in kindergarten yet. And then I just want to point out that those three sectors, obviously, when you're looking at this pie, you can see it, but just those three subsectors account for just almost half of total charitable giving. But we also look at gifts to grant-making foundations. So when we're looking at what is included here, that includes private foundations, community foundations, family foundations, all sorts of foundations except for corporate foundations. So giving to grant-making foundations reached around $80 billion in 2025. Then let's move to public society benefit, which accounted for 11% of total giving in 2025. So I get a lot of questions about what kinds of nonprofits are included in public society benefit. This is a bit of a range of different kinds of nonprofits. So we look at nonprofits that are related to community and economic development. We also include organizations that advocate for different rights or different specific groups of people. So in this, we look at advocacy and social justice causes. And in this area, we also include what we call pass-through organizations. So that would include the United Way, that would include Jewish federations, and it actually includes national charitable sponsors of donor-advised funds. So for example, the National Philanthropic Trust, Fidelity Charitable. We also include DAF Giving 360 and Vanguard Charitable. So we've seen substantial growth in giving to donor-advised funds at those national level sponsors. That has driven a lot of the growth, as well as giving to social justice causes, things like that. Both of those have driven growth in public society benefit giving, which reached $72 billion in 2025. Next is giving to health organizations. This includes all kinds of nonprofit health organizations, hospitals and hospital systems, as well as local clinics, which accounted for in total of 9% of total giving, reaching $61 billion in 2025. International affairs accounted for 5% of total giving at $33 billion. In Giving USA, when we look at international giving, what we are looking at is giving that originates in the United States. So whether that's individual donors, foundation donors, those are donors that are based in the United States who give to organizations within the United States that then give to organizations abroad. Whether this is for any cause, whether that's a natural disaster, um, advocacy for different groups, um, human services types of benefits, all of those are included under international affairs if those dollars eventually reach international nonprofits. And finally, we have arts and culture groups, which accounted for a total of 4% of total giving, reaching $27.3 billion in 2025, and environment and animals. So this is a combined subsector that includes all giving for environmental issues, but we also include giving to animal rights, animal support, which came to $24.57 billion. Now, the last share of the pie is the 4% that goes to individuals. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, but you just told us that Giving USA measures giving to 501c3 registered organizations. So, what this dollar amount represents is the giving mostly by corporations, and not only corporations, but mostly looking at pharmaceutical companies that are giving more and more each year to patient assistant programs that end up going directly to individuals. What that is donations of pharmaceuticals. That is a growing number that we do look at for that is included in our corporate dollars. So it's beginning to take a larger share of our pie each year. So we go ahead and account for it here. So that accounted for a little over $25 billion in 2025. So having looked at the share that each of those subsectors accounted for in 2025, I always like to highlight where the most growth was. So the three subsectors that we saw the most dramatic growth in for 2025 included education, public society benefit, and the environment. So the environment, again, accounts for only a total of 4% of total giving, but we are seeing that growth reach some of the highest growth that we see across any subsectors. So you'll see on this bar, the dark gold bars represent the giving in 2025. And then the kind of beige bars represent the 5-year average. So you'll see in each of those three subsectors, they experienced growth of 11% or more in 2025. And even their 5-year average was over 8%. So I think that's important to just show that these kind of strong growth trends in those three subsectors really are not just for 2025, but also for the most recent periods. So I'd like to just point out that those subsectors showed the highest annualized rates of growth. And what that means is when we look at total growth over that 5-year period, but we average that out over each of those 5 years, those 8% numbers or 10% number for environment come out pretty high in terms of the highest growth. Ready for our third code word, 789. I'll give everyone a few minutes to tap that into your app. And I will go ahead and move forward. So 789. So again, looking at all of those subsectors, as I mentioned, education, public society benefit, and the environment and animals all saw growth of 11% or more in current dollars. But let's take a look at the other subsectors as well. So you can see that we kind of have a second tier of faster growing subsectors that includes human services, as well as health and arts, culture, and humanities. Now, the biggest takeaway that you'll probably see on this chart is that giving to foundations actually dropped in 2025. And looking at this chart, that looks pretty substantial. In current dollars, that drop was 16.2%. Even when adjusted for inflation, that drop was 18.3%. So let's take a closer look at what we are seeing in giving to foundations. So on these bars, you can see that the all-time high in giving to foundations was in 2024. And then if we look at what came after that, so in 2024, we saw giving to foundations at $94 billion. The next highest on record was in 2021 when giving to foundations reached $91.48 billion. And then if we look for the third highest bar, we see that that's actually 2025, where giving to foundations was $79 billion. So that helps us put this into perspective in that we were coming off of a relatively high year. The second or the highest year in 2024 that we've seen on record in current dollars. So we saw a drop for sure, but we're still in the range of the top three highest years for giving to foundations. So yes, it was a drop. Yes, it felt significant, but in the big scheme of things, it's not too bad. We're still seeing giving to foundations at a pretty strong rate. Now, I'd like to just wrap up by giving you a few action steps that you can take based on what we're seeing in Giving USA trends. So, the first number one trend that I would like to point out is I would encourage you all to embrace planned giving. Prepare for planned giving. Make sure that you have at least one staff member who is fluent in different kinds of bequests and different kinds of planned gifts, qualified charitable distributions, annual gift annuities, things like that, because we're starting to see growth, but I promise you we're going to see more. The great wealth transfer is coming. The second point that I'd like to share with you is that even though we are seeing growth in mega donors, I would encourage you to continue to pursue the large gifts, but make sure that you continue to appeal to everyday donors. And as part of that, make sure that you're looking at ways to appeal to younger donors. So both of those kinds of donors appreciate the opportunity to give smaller gifts, to make recurring gifts, which are easy to set up online. Make sure that you're giving them online opportunities to do so. One thing that I would also like to point out, we didn't really talk about the new One Big Beautiful Bill and the changes that that is bringing. Those changes really are coming in 2026 for the most part. So included in those is a new universal charitable deduction for non-itemizing donors up to $1,000 a person. So I would encourage you to remind your smaller donors that that is available to them. Just make sure that you note that that is only for direct gifts. So giving to or through donor advised funds or foundations, it doesn't qualify for that universal charitable deduction. So just make sure that they're aware of that. As part of that, as I mentioned with number three, I encourage you to engage those next gen donors. So really those are our millennials and our Gen Z donors. They're very tech driven. They not only give online, but they look online both in social media, they look at websites of your nonprofit organization to look at the impact that you're making and to just see what you're doing out there. So I encourage you to keep all of your tech communication up to date. Next gen donors are also very interested in volunteer opportunities. So in some of our data, we've actually seen that, interestingly, for next gen donors, there are as many of them who are volunteering as who are giving, sometimes more. So many of those next gen donors kind of develop their initial relationship with nonprofits through their volunteering before they give. So be sure to try to create those pathways, those opportunities for them to come to your organization through volunteer opportunities. And they are looking for volunteer chances to build their skills, which transfer nicely into their professional skills, and to build their networks. And be transparent about impact and accountability, because those are concerns that Next Gen donors are especially focused on. Point 4, make sure that you have a process in place for processing donor advised fund gifts. Make sure that you know how to access and thank donors who are giving through donor advised funds, whether they are anonymous. You can usually reach out through their organization that they gave through, like a Vanguard Charitable, for example. And just make sure that you have staff members in place who understand how to process those gifts. And we do know that the One Big Beautiful Bill has many new policies in place that will actually reduce the deductibility, the tax deductibility for itemizing donors. So we may start to see gradually over time that more of those itemizing donors are strategically giving through a DAF that allows them to give larger donations in one year that they will dole out to the nonprofits like yourselves over a number of years. So just be aware of that and be communicating openly and often with your donors who use donor advised funds to make sure that the two of you understand what is best for that donor. And then finally, number 5, going back to the discussion that we had about corporate donations. Corporate giving is changing. Make sure that you are prepared to talk to your donors who are giving. Make sure that you understand where they are employed, know where the big corporate donors are in your community, and promote the fact that you are happy to check on any matching gifts that are available through those employers. So promote them and ask for them. And with that said, that concludes my presentation on Giving USA for 2025. I do want to share with you the website here and where you can actually access the full report and data tables and all of that. And also at the Lilly School of Philanthropy here at Indiana University, we do quite a bit of other research too, outside of Giving USA, although Giving USA is our largest research project. So I'm just sharing with you a link there for access to more research. But I would be, oh, and sorry, last code word for you is 500. So that makes an easy one. So be sure to put that in. And Cassie, I'll pass it to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Christina. That was great. I always love learning and listening and picking up a few things. I do have a couple questions I want to ask, but before I do that, you mentioned the One Big Beautiful Bill and the impact it has on charitable organizations. We actually have a recorded webinar on our website about all those provisions that are strictly, it is geared to our nonprofit clients. So I'm going to put a link to that webinar in the chat if anyone would like to access that webinar. And, you know, we're always a good source of information. So if you've got questions about specifically how that may affect your nonprofit, happy to answer any questions there. The first question I wanted to maybe ask you is, there's a big growth in the public society benefit that includes donor advised funds, and a surprisingly, for me at least, a big drop in giving to foundations. Does that seem like a new trend that, you know, where people used to use foundations, that's kind of going by the wayside and moving toward donor advised funds? Are you seeing this anecdotally? Do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. Actually, Cassie, that's an excellent question. So let me start by saying that giving to foundations, just like bequests, tends to be variable. So we do see quite a bit of fluctuation from one year to the next in giving to foundations. So with that said, though, I will say that yes, we are seeing more trends toward donor advised funds. And as you can imagine, donors who have foundations have significant administrative burdens with just managing those. There are costs involved in that. There's a lot of legal framework for foundations. So there are legal requirements, there are legal limitations as far as how to give and when to give and who to give to and so forth. So a lot of donors, particularly at family foundations, smaller independent foundations, are starting to reevaluate how important it is to give to through a foundation versus just giving to and through donor advised funds. So we are seeing some family foundations and those smaller independent foundations actually close and transfer those assets to donor advised funds. But in addition to that, we are also seeing more even private foundations using donor advised funds for their giving. So many foundations are allocating a share of their annual payouts. They're actually giving a share of those through donor advised funds as well. And of course, community foundations use donor advised funds pretty substantially. And we're seeing some growth in the use of donor advised funds at at community foundations, both for individual donors, but also pooling donations from many, many donors, particularly for things like natural disasters or other issues that are specific to an individual community.
Thank you. Perfect. Um, I'm going to read this question from the Q&A, and I think I know what this is getting at, and it's something we've talked to you about before. The question was, does giving to foundations include giving from foundations to foundations? What I'm wondering if this person is asking, and we've kind of talked about this, okay, if I give a gift to a donor advised fund, it counts in your study as going to a donor advised fund. Then what happens when it comes out of the donor advised fund? Is that double counted? How do you react to that foundation to foundation giving, and maybe talk about how that's accounted for in your study?
Sure. Another excellent question. So, obviously, that's a really tricky area. The way we handle that in our data for Giving USA is that we look at total dollars that go into foundations and go into DAFs. So I'm kind of handling both of those questions at the same time because in Giving USA, we address them the same way. We actually take the net value of dollars going in and grants coming out from both of those types of giving vehicles. So when you see the data, we've already accounted for that. So the reason, of course, as you mentioned in the question, is that we don't want to double count. So each year we only include the net going into each of those giving vehicles, being both foundations and donor advised funds, and then what is going out.
One of the questions in the chat, and I'm not sure if this is part of your study, so please feel free to tell us if it's not, but was just a question about percentage of income. So you referenced mega donors earlier. You're talking about donors. Is there a difference between percentage of income for those mega donors and maybe your everyday donor? Is that something that you guys look at?
We don't actually look at the percentage of income that mega donors give. That's a different factor. But I will say, in terms of overall individual gifts, or giving or donors, I should say, which includes mega donors and everyday donors at all income levels. So the overall percentage of personal disposable income that individual donors gave in 2025 was 1.7%. Now, just to put that into perspective, compared to other years, because without a bit of perspective, that number doesn't mean anything to us. So on average, if we look at the past 40 years, the percent of total personal disposable income that goes to charitable giving tends to range from about 1.7% up to 2%. So obviously in 2025, we're at the low end of that. Not a record low, not lower than we've ever seen, but we are on the low end of what we typically see.
And you talked about this earlier. Does that relate to the consumer sentiment factor? You know, we have these, I think we maybe saw this a little bit during COVID where the market was doing really, really well, but you didn't see the big jump in giving. It's because of these unknown sentiment issues.
Yes, Cassie, that's exactly right. So the bottom line is when both individuals and institutions like foundations, when everyone feels financially secure, they give. And in the United States, we have a very strong culture of that. However, if there are issues going on in the economy where people just don't know what's going to be happening, so a sense of uncertainty, a sense of insecurity, then that does impact the percentage of disposable income that people give. So yes, those two things are definitely coordinated. Um, so that low consumer sentiment number, which is below 20 and a negative 20%, definitely had something to do with the fact that we're seeing giving as a percent of disposable income at a general low.
As we've done this with you through the years, we've talked a lot about how individuals give the most out of any other category, and your slides represent that. But that percentage of giving has declined over the years. Maybe talk about organizations and how they can use this data to search for new types of philanthropy from differing sources. Sounds like particularly from bequests, but also donor advised funds.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So that's the biggest change that's happening. So I still encourage everyone to pursue, continue to pursue the individual donors just as you always have. That is your foundation, even with institutional foundations or corporate donors. One of the things that they want to see is that a nonprofit has a very strong foundation of individual donors. But with that said, it's the same thing with foundations in particular, and as with corporations. Foundations are very strategic in their giving. They have set out particular giving goals or areas in which their funding is set out to address. So, on the part of the nonprofits, one of the things that is really helpful for you to do is to actually become more strategic as well. So, whether you are approaching foundations or whether you are approaching corporations, do your research, make sure that the organizations or the institutions you're approaching have a common interest in what your nonprofit provides. So, for example, make sure that they support giving to human services. Make sure that that's one of their key target areas before you work on developing that relationship or work on those applications. With donor advised funds, that is a very important area that continues to grow. We're seeing a lot of continued emphasis and growth in that area. One of the things that we are seeing is that historically, donor advised funds have been used mostly by wealthier donors or major donors. Today, we are seeing that more and more everyday donors are beginning to use donor advised funds. So, a couple of ways that nonprofits can take advantage of that or focus on that is by simply in your promotional materials on your websites and print materials, wherever you fundraise, add a note or add some information on the fact that you accept donor advised funds. Tell your donors, let us know if you have a donor advised fund. We'd be happy to work with you on how you can coordinate that with us, coordinate your gifts with your donor advised fund. Interestingly, a lot of nonprofits are concerned about donor advised fund grants or gifts coming in anonymously. Our research shows that really only 9% of donor advised fund grants are anonymous. So many of those gifts are actually so when the holder of the donor advised fund processes that gift, they have the option to make that anonymous or not. So part of that can come through your communication. If you're communicating with those donors up front, let them know, let us know that you're making that gift because we'd love to develop that relationship. So I hope that that kind of gives an overview of how to just communicate upfront. It's the same regarding those corporate donations. It's the same with donor advised funds as well as matching gifts through corporate employers. So let your donors know upfront that you'd be happy to help them coordinate a matching gift. You'd be happy to help them work with their donor advised fund sponsor to process those gifts, make the most out of those gifts.
Maybe last question. I am hoping that I'm not asking you to read your crystal ball or putting you on the spot, but I think Giving USA released an article about this. Do you have expectations with the effect that the One Big Beautiful Bill may have on giving that organizations should be prepared for, really change the way charitable contributions are deducted on the returns? And so what are your thoughts on what we might see in 2026 with respect to impact?
Mm-hmm. Another really important question. So, our school actually published a report on the impact of charitable giving impact from the One Big Beautiful Bill. So that can actually be accessed free of charge on our website that I shared the link with. Just to give you a very high level overview of what that report shares is that I mentioned in my report or my presentation here for non-itemizing donors, there is a new charitable deduction available to them, and that is up to $1,000 per donor. So for a married couple, it's up to $2,000. That is new. That will help those smaller donors. Does not apply their donations to donor advised funds or foundations. So you want to make them aware of that. But that new deduction is expected to actually increase giving by smaller donors, by everyday donors who do not itemize their charitable deductions or other deductions on their taxes. Generally speaking, the other impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill are expected to decrease charitable giving by donors who do itemize on their tax returns. The main reason is because the new policies, reduce the deductibility. For example, donors at the highest tax bracket, which is 37.5%, they will now only be able to deduct, I think, 35% of any donations that they make. So we're seeing a reduction there. There will be reductions in terms of the total amount of their deductions. So there will be a reduced amount that any donor who itemizes can deduct in total from their tax returns. So in general, we do expect those to have a dampening effect on giving by the larger donors. But for more information, I would encourage you to go to our website at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, look for latest research, and that report is called Philanthropy Outlook. So I won't be looking into my crystal ball today, but that will give you a chance to look into the crystal ball that we have put together in terms of the data.
Thank you. Christina, thank you so much for joining us today. I always love hearing from you about the insights from the study. Just a reminder, we are going to send out the recording of this webinar. And if you'd like to receive emails about future nonprofit events or industry updates, please make sure you visit ksmcpa.com/subscribe and subscribing to our nonprofit newsletter update. Happy to have you there. If you are near our Indianapolis headquarters, we will be having a follow-up event in person in August, so please watch your email for that event. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We're thrilled to have you here and appreciate your participation. And thank you, Christina, for all your great thoughts.
Thank you. It's always a joy, and the KSM team is always so much fun to work with. And best of luck, everyone, for a wonderful 26.
Thank you.